sessions, we've been having a few. Sorry, my name is Christine Geraghty. We've been having a few technological problems, so I think what we're going to do is to actually start with what is on the programme as the second paper, and then hopefully we'll be able to rejoin us. So we've got 3 presentations today as usual, and I'm going to introduce people as they're before the presentations rather than doing everybody at once. So Christina Wilkins is an early career researcher in the areas of film, television and literature. Her particular focus is adaptation studies, and she has primarily written about contemporary television adaptations. Her book on vampire narratives was published in 2018, and she's contributed to a number of TV collections. Her book, Embodying Adaptation, will be published this year. So over to you, Christina. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. Let me just set this up. Just checking everyone can see everything as I need them to.
Yeah, that's good.
Great.
That's fine, we can hear you.
I want to start by addressing Jason Jacobs' point on discussing recent television. He argues that it's difficult because, quote, one is always aware that one's proximity to the immediacy of its putative aesthetic thrills threatens the reliability of judgment, perhaps because we are forcing the issue before the material has had an opportunity to insinuate its resonances, discourses and achievements into the critical spaces, traditions and debates necessary for it to establish a reliable presence as part of our cultural heritage. In discussing Netflix's Archive 81, a series released only 6 months ago, arguably I may fall victim to what Jacobs calls its aesthetic thrills. However, I'm not here to discuss the merits or the pitfalls of the series, but merely to situate it as an example of a wider debate in television studies. It provides a useful way of thinking about the intersections between aesthetics, television and adaptation, and specifically how the latter presents opportunities for a rethinking of the boundaries of television and the attendant hierarchies that come with such definitions. There have already been discussions at this conference over the last few weeks about how we come to define television, with the advent of streaming allowing for the spilling of the TV text over the frame of the traditional TV set. Some of the ways in which we understand television as bound by its technology have shifted. Kim Hebben argued last week that television has always wanted to reinvent itself, for example, and it continues to do so. And with that comes a need to address this theoretically. And this is being done by various scholars in the field, exploring the impact of streaming on viewership and meaning, for example. But I think it's useful here to take a television studies approach. So with television aesthetics comes many discussions of value and judgment. And again, something touched upon in a fascinating panel last week with Brett Mills, for example. And that included debates around which texts are worthy of judgment. And I'm not going to enter into this debate, but rather focus on the ways in which television aesthetics thinks about the boundaries of television. The specific focus on aesthetics facilitates a thinking of form and style, which is useful in understanding where television's boundaries lie, or indeed whether they are as fixed as we might want to believe. Television as a medium contains many categories, not just of genre, but format, from the episodic to the television event. So it's hard to judge at times how to understand the specific text we may encounter. And this is also evident in discussions about value and judgment of television. As Jacobs argues, the terms of judgment will vary according to what is under consideration. We will not consider a game show or news programme in the same way as a serial drama, even if they share on the face of it dramatic force, narrative dynamics and creativity. The different approaches necessitated, I think, can be expanded upon, or rather understood differently, by aligning them with approaches in adaptation. Often within the field, there's a tendency to think in medium-specific ways, presenting a comparative or evaluative approach dependent on the boundaries of the mediums the adaptations cross. Mediums, says Marianne Doan, come with constraints and possibilities, and the understanding of them, she argues, needs to be historically and culturally specific. Therefore, when addressing an adaptation through questions of medium, context is key. And what these shifting constraints and possibilities also mean, though, is that the boundaries are unfixed. And we might consider Deborah Jaramillo's discussion of television and the cinematic, wherein she argues that Television is implicated in bombarding the viewer with hyperstylation or no style at all, while in special spaces it imitates another medium of higher esteem. And I want to use this position of imitation and esteem to think about the recent Netflix series Archive 81. As an adaptation of a podcast, the series offers something different to the usual adaptation approach. Variously categorised as melodrama and horror by critics, the series uses an element of form and style from cinema, television, and the podcast it is adapted from. This results in a mix of categories that ask the viewer to think outside the medium and, as this paper argues, is a central attraction of the series. It deliberately presents itself as intertextual, borrowing from a range of references, mediums, which include found footage, and time periods jumping between the 90s and the present, to create this layered story. And this, I believe, is becoming more commonplace as streaming services look to garner more niche audiences through reference to particular cultural moments. By taking the format of television, yet interweaving these other elements, Archive 81 asks us to read simultaneously on several levels, whilst being aware of the excess of televisuality. It self-consciously uses these elements of the televisual, and rather than imitating, borrows from other mediums and styles, not for esteem, but to engage the viewer in a reflexive thinking about medium. I'm going to use Archive 81 then to show how the use of intertextuality and the fact of adaptation evidences a way of thinking about television that transcends traditional understandings of its boundaries, and is in fact arguably the future of our media landscape, which sounds like a much grander claim than it is, I will say that now. So when the series Archive 81 was first announced, showrunner Rebecca Sonnenschein framed it as follows. She said, "We're hoping to give the supernatural horror genre a new twist, while keeping a dark, deeply emotional romance at its core." This attempt at a new twist was apparent in the series' inspiration, an ongoing found footage horror podcast of the same name, released in April 2016 by Daniel Powell and Mark Solinger. So in the podcast, an archivist, Dan, is asked to catalogue a series of old audio tapes that contain interviews by a young woman, Melody, as she interviews the residents of a mysterious Vista building in Manhattan. Throughout the first podcast series, we learn about the strange events in the building and start to question what's happened to the Dan, the guy doing the footage or reconstructing it. Netflix's take on the podcast presents a different approach to the found footage genre, clearly aiming for the twist that Sonnenschein notes. Whilst it may not be the first podcast to be adapted to screen, this is quite a recent phenomenon detailed by various critics, it is a notable example. The 8-episode Netflix series was released January 2022, quickly finding its place in the top 10 most viewed shows on the series in its first few weeks. So the series follows Dan, this archivist, after he's approached by the mysterious Virgil Davenport, offering an exorbitant amount of money to clean up and digitise some old footage. And this conceit frames the series, giving us a reason for engaging with the found footage mode. The opening to the podcast of the same name uses a different framing device, stating that there must be audio recording for legal purposes, using the recording as a kind of explanation for what we're hearing. And the Netflix series, however, doesn't offer any kind of device like that for explaining how the audience comes to watch Dan's experience with the tapes, only explaining why the tapes are important. So the difference in the medium of the adaptation, so moving from the audio to the visual, is crucial in how these ideas are mediated, allowing for different approaches to the text and approaches to found footage. There are several ways to approach the adaptation of a podcast, and Netflix's Archive 81 shows its links to the oral nature of the text it adapts, embedding the podcast form, this is how we see the podcast titles, into the series itself, with Dan's friend Mark, played by Matt McGorry, running the Mystery Signals podcast. So we literally see him creating this podcast, a nod to the Dead Signals subtitle of Archive 81's podcast form. Netflix's Archive 81 creates tension through oral moments, most notably through the mysterious tune that Melody hears through the walls at night, which pervades the series, rising later in flashbacks to Dan's childhood and in another older snuff film linked to the building's inhabitants. So the soundtrack itself works well to establish the horror feel of the show. And this reliance on the oral moments to create the awe of the show interestingly pushes the boundaries of the frame of the series. I think a viewer searching on Spotify for Archive 81 would find both the podcast, which we see on the left, and the soundtrack on the right. Each oral links to what they've witnessed in the televisual format, but showing how the two texts spill over the boundaries and into one another. It's this notion of boundaries and of the frame that provides an interesting way to understand the series. So found footage texts, as Cecilia said, are not presented to us as inspired by real events. They are supposed to constitute the audiovisual documentation of these events. In watching it, we may assume found footage is authentic or has a trace of reality. Viewers may see the characters as real people. And this presentation of the fictional as real, or at the very least ambiguous in origin, has implications for our understanding of reality. As Syed continues, sorry, the combination of the work's uncertain fictional status playfully collapses the boundaries separating the depicted universe from reality, and by extension challenges the ontological status of the fiction film as self-contained object. It is presented not as mere artifact, but as fragment of the real world, and the implication is that its material might well spill over into it. The aesthetics of Archive 81 push at these boundaries and their relationship to reality, in several instances literally as a face pushes through the frame of a screen Dan is working at. Dan is both observer and creator of the found footage in a sense. Through his work restoring it, he must tirelessly reconstruct the film of the damaged videotapes and then watch it back to check all is in order. And the series recognises this, with various moments showing the physical and reconstruction of these VHS tapes. He, like us, observes the found footage. Unlike us, however, he begins to play a role connecting with the subject stuck on screen in the past. As Adam Daniel argues, found footage places a different emphasis on narrative, referring it instead onto changes in sound and image, visual distortion and haptic qualities. Archive 81 being seen as found footage may be debatable, however, although the series is described as such and the podcast as found footage horror podcast, the transgression of boundaries pushes too far over the limits of the frame. We see this in the startling shift from the grainy footage of Melody in the 90s, which we see, you can see the camera in the background there, that's how we're sort of engaged in that image, until into a sudden clarity of the image as the frame of the camera disappears. So here we can actually see the camera itself. And this is the clearest signal the series is not to be read solely as found footage, and perhaps the point at which we realise there is no threat of reality spilling over, as we are far beyond it. Although, as Syed argues, nowadays the satisfaction of watching a found footage horror comes precisely from the knowledge that the film is lying to us, we do not get the sustained opportunity to believe in the lie of the footage. The series falters at this point. The moment the frame of the camera is removed, the subsequent use of it feels a bit like a contrived plot device. Now, despite this, the use of the camera in this way establishes the importance of these frames and boundaries to the understanding of reality. The foreboding credits and eerie cold opens we assume linked to the puzzle of what's going on in the Vista building establish the reality of Archive 81. And as the series progresses, each cold open becomes more distinct, touching upon names we've now heard mentioned, and through a variety of different formats, including adverts and clips for films. This move across form works well with the genre of the show, as horror has never been contained within a predominant media form, says Daniel. The continued shift between one reality and another, as well as one form, so found footage, and another, so more traditional realist film style, echoes the process of the adaptation, as well as the inability to be contained. This inability to be contained, I think, links nicely to the notion of excess, and in fact renders the series more televisual than it links to other forms. Its links to other forms may lead us to believe. As Jaramillo argues, when television is televisual, it is excessive. And although the series subverts the usual mode of found footage by showing us the frame, this works with the adapted nature of the text. It is a series built around the shifts across and connections with other media. Some have likened it to the book House of Leaves, a contemporary supernatural story laced with the uncanny for this approach. And primarily the sense of the uncanny comes from the use of technology and the borders it creates, as well as how these borders frame the past. There is both a familiarity and unease with the connection that Dan and we have with the events of the past, and a belief that if we immerse ourselves enough in it, we can change it. Archive 81 becomes a kind of amalgamated version of the present reality that intersects with the past, relies on it even to create contemporary relevance. This commingling of 90s culture and now is perfect for representing how we consistently feel the need to either reuse or recycle the past, and, I would argue, a need to reuse or perhaps reappropriate elements of other mediums. The series thereby becomes a thinking of the constraints and possibilities of technology. We see this through the way in which the frame of the screen is ever present and the way in which it's presented. The past is literally trapped in the boundaries of the traditional frame of the television, as we can see in the title sequence. So in that sequence, then we have these moments of, we see the sound waves, we see the frame of the television, but the frame becomes this mode of containment, a kind of capturing. And when we start to move away from the limits of these frames, as Archive 81 does, that becomes vital, and not just for the series, but as an example of the progressive nature of the medium, or progression of the medium as a whole. And this is facilitated also by its status as adaptation. So adaptation is a thinking about a changing of form and style, a repetition, not replication, as Linda Hutchin argues. And these repetitions link to the thematic or plot elements, arguably, but here they also embody elements of the form through the oral links we get in Archive 81, as well as those to other mediums. There cannot be replication, and this is key. We might think, going back to the idea of TV wanting to reinvent itself, if we could think perhaps of adaptation as a reinvention, then that allows for a reinvention of the form the story is told to us in, and moving beyond the boundaries the story may have been initially defined by. But I would say adaptation is less reinvention often than more of a reconfiguration, a movement between, across and around. And television often entails this kind of reconfiguration of forms, of content, and the key thing being their movement. Thinking in this way, as in through an adaptation studies lens, enables us to strengthen the intertextual links between texts and illuminate the slipperiness of the culturally specific boundaries we use to categorise mediums and texts. This, however, is arguably not the most helpful for television studies, or indeed a study of any particular medium, given it makes identifying and understanding a text much more of a frustrating and perhaps vague conceit. But I think every now and again it is useful to step back from those boundaries and admire their flexibility. Given television's persistent association with other forms, most notably the cinematic, which both Mills and Jaramillo have argued implies a hierarchy, along with the idea that television, as Jaramillo says, has no one coherent language or style, assessing what it can do through not its imitation, but its use of other forms, shows us, or perhaps gives us hope for a long future of television. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Christina. Really, really very interesting. Okay, so we'll come back to hopefully in questions and discussion. So now I'm looking to see if Will is with us.
I believe I am. Hello.
Right, excellent.
Thank you for bearing
There
with
we go, good. Welcome back, Will. Okay, so are you ready to give your paper now?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, let me just introduce you then. So Will Standford Abbiss recently graduated with a PhD from Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. His research focuses on representations of nationhood in long-form television drama. And in his study, he was trying to establish a post-heritage critical framework through which a range of drama could be studied. A monograph is arising from this research and is forthcoming, and he's published articles on The Crown, The Affair, and Upstairs, Downstairs in various journals. So, Will, welcome to the conference, and off you go.
Thanks so much, Christine. So the research I'm going to be delivering today is kind of a midpoint between a chapter of my PhD thesis in which I looked at Dickensian and its soap opera form, and the expansion that I'm undergoing in order to revise it for my monograph version. So expanding in this case to consider the status of Dickens adaptations more generally, more broadly. So I'm going to start off today by placing Dickens adaptations within the broader context of television adaptations. So on this first slide, oh, I hope my slides are going to move, otherwise I'll have a lot of difficulty. Let's try that. There we go. Wonderful. Okay, so the first slide, we've got a snapshot of important current ideas in adaptation studies, which I'm very open to talking more about during our Q&A session. So Shannon Wells Lasagna identifies the institutional incentives for long-form adaptations, and conversely, the limitations of traditional classic serials, such as generally Dickens adaptations as we'd usually think of them, which are made finite by the conclusion of their source texts. So examples of this, The Handmaid's Tale and The Leftovers, both adaptations that adapt directly their source texts, their source novels in their first seasons, and then continue on after that. And Sanderton doing a similar thing, but kind of escaping the idea of the ending by finishing an unfinished novel of Jane Austen's, and then later being granted a second season to continue the narrative from there. And then Christopher Hogg has discussed this idea of franchise building, the importance of franchise building during the peak TV era, and especially in the light of the emergence of global SVOD services. So in terms of examples from that, Hogg talks about the Star Wars franchise of Disney Plus, but I'd suggest perhaps pretty much everything that Disney Plus has commissioned in terms of scripted content, from Marvel to Star Wars to the Muppets, is deeply embedded in the franchises that come under Disney and Fox and everything else that they now own. And then we've got the expanded story worlds that emerge from the Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones universes as being plundered by Amazon and HBO respectively over this year. So this is a really important area to be looking at how it develops at this time in the context of television more generally. I'm also suggesting, along with Duncan MacLean, that a real shining example of the potential of expansive adaptations is HBO's Watchmen from 2019, which is both a sequel and a revision to the comic book series, and enjoyable both in the independence of its source text and with knowledge of it. So MacLean discusses Watchmen as an extension of the comics, identifying its fidelity to the spirit rather than to the letter of the source material, while also centering the concept of race as a new cultural perspective for the narrative. So I'm suggesting today that it's useful to see Dickens adaptations in this light too, recognising their potential for expanded and even continuing dramas and a diversity of representation to examine Dickens's past through the act of revision. And Dickensian offers a really interesting model in which this was attempted and sadly not successful in terms of not being recommissioned for a second season. So Dickensian, if you haven't seen it, is an attempt at a long-form Dickens adaptation which takes characters from multiple Dickens novels and places them together in soap-style prequel narratives. And by my reading, one of the reasons why it wasn't as successful as it could have been, certainly narratively, is that tendency towards prequels rather than revisions, which veers a bit too close, in my view, towards fidelity and not daring to overwrite anything Dickens did by just simply placing its multiple narratives prior to the various source texts. Today we're going to look closely at a couple of examples of Dickensian's female characters and the potentiality that their storylines display. So first we have Miss Havisham, here's called Amelia, played by Tuppence Middleton. So Dickensian's prequel narrative develops Miss Havisham's backstory, taking her to the point where she's jilted, stops her clocks and retreats into the existence where she's found in Great Expectations. And this allows the social status of women in Dickens's time to be interrogated. So in the narrative of Dickensian, Amelia inherits her father's brewing business over her brother Arthur, and over the course of the series is duped into a relationship with the sinister Compeyson in a plan to swindle her out of her fortune. All outlined very briefly by Dickens in Great Expectations in this case, but expanded on greatly by being told through Dickensian's prequel narrative. The final movement of Amelia's story in Dickensian is not just her jilting, but the discovery of her betrayal by her brother and fiancé, and the emotions that this brings out in her. As Armel Parry has established, Amelia becomes the heroine of her own story. Pip from Great Expectations, of course, is not born at this point of her life. So Parry says, in addition, she is in Dickensian a victim of gender prejudice. She'll be judged competent and will she be judged competent, and will she be trusted at the head of her late father's brewery? Adversity due to her sex makes her more fragile, and Arthur and Compeyson are shown to take advantage of this. Camilla Nelson, meanwhile, calls Amelia a Medusa figure, identifying the justified rage she is allowed to display in Dickensian. So Nelson says Jordan's television adaptation is one of the few, if not the first, to recognise that from the standpoint of a more egalitarian age, stripped of the gender stereotypes that engulf the character, Miss Havisham had every right to be mad. And this is displayed when, despite being very much alive still, she transcends the corporeal realm and appears as a wailing spectre to Arthur in the drama's closing scenes. Dickensian also foregrounds its participation in the televisual tradition of Dickens adaptations through acknowledging the audience's cultural awareness of its characters, more so than the details of their respective novels do. For instance, Little Nell from the Old Curiosity Shop is found at death's door in the first episode of Dickensian, but survives at the last moment, an early sign of Dickensian's ultimate reluctance to fully revise any of its source texts. Additionally, despite Parry's note that relationships between characters from different novels are limited in their impact, the friendship between Amelia and Honoria Barbary is foregrounded. So Honoria, who's on the left here, who becomes Bleak House's Lady Dedlock, is surely best viewed in the public consciousness in the guise of Gillian Anderson, who played her in the 2005 adaptation of Bleak House. And Anderson was also the most recent Miss Havisham at the time of Dickensian's broadcast. So the empathy between the two younger women in Dickensian appears to have been a metatextual reference to their narrative futures having been portrayed by the same woman in the last decade. This helps to build the Dickens story world as a multi-textual media property of which prior adaptations are a part. Hence the dominance in Dickensian of the most recognisable Dickens works and characters, of which Bleak House can be counted amongst, thanks to the status granted by the very influential 2005 adaptation. Also of interest in reclaiming the female voice from Dickens is the portrayal of Bob Cratchit's wife, who in Dickensian is played by Jennifer Hennessy, who's on the left here. So this is a character who isn't even granted a first name in A Christmas Carol, but her two recent portrayals on television have thrust her into the foreground. Following Dickensian's cancellation, the BBC returned to a more familiar form of Dickens adaptations, i.e. one novel at a time, commissioning a cycle to be written by Stephen Knight, who's best known as the creator and writer of Peaky Blinders. Now, presumably due to COVID, although I don't think there's been any direct reporting of this, but so far only the curtain raise of A Christmas Carol has been shown at Christmas 2019, although, as we'll discuss a bit later, Great Expectations is imminent and is being filmed. But this alone gave an indication of Knight's revisionist intentions for his adaptations. So we're going to move back to his version of Mrs. Cratchit afterwards, but first we need to see how Dickensian's version, named Emily, impacts the narrative. So Mary is the very catalyst here of the A Christmas Carol narrative in Knight's reading. She summons the spirits and causes Scrooge's redemption that is the foundation of the whole story, and also transcends the linguistic propriety we might expect from period drama with her last line there. So we're going to move on to talk briefly about the soap opera conventions utilised by both these two dramas. So Dickensian uses the production conventions of soap genre, which is hybridised with a high-end period drama. So it utilises economies of scale through utilising a composite set within which the entire drama is set. So Benjamin Poore discusses composite sets being used in period drama by looking at The Paradise from 2012 to 2013, and his description of it reads that the shops, streets and alleyways are all fully dressed to look real, and hence the actors can be filmed in tracking shots coming out of a house and walking to another location without the need to cut or adjust the camera angle to avoid breaking the illusion of a complete three-dimensional world. So it's a livable, real space within which the drama is set. Yet, well, there's two drawbacks really. Firstly, Dickensian is completely restricted to its composite set, which starts to feel a bit enclosed after a number of episodes. And also the fact of its cancellation means that the economies of scales the economies of scale that it attempted to make use of were not capitalised upon, because you need scale, you need extra seasons in order for that to reap its rewards. And in fact, the first season of Dickensian, having created this large set, was extremely expensive. Sorry, excuse me. Also, the female friendship that we saw between Honoria and Amelia is a convention of soap opera, as Christine, our chair, has talked about in her book from 1991. So Geraghty says the female conversation is the backbone of the traditional soap. They handle the complex web of relationships which make up a soap opera with a care and intensity that makes the men seem clumsy and uncomprehending. And also reflecting on Amelia's story is the notion of women in business being central to the soap opera conventions also. So this quote also from Geraghty: "This treatment of the public sphere of work, business and employment as if it was the private sphere repays further examination. It ensures that women, because of their capabilities in the personal sphere, are also seen to be capable in the business world." So also the notion of the emotions felt by Amelia and Mary being prioritised over the narrative of events which are likely to already be known by the viewer through the adaptations of such canonical text is symptomatic in general of what Robert Allen calls the paradigmatic complexity of soap opera. So there's multiple ways in which soap opera conventions are come to bear on these two-period dramas. So where next for Dickens adaptations? Well, we've got Dodger that came out this year on CBBC, although it has been promoted to BBC One, which is long form and original narratives set prior to Oliver Twist's arrival in Fagin's gang, and has been very positively received, and also incorporates some educational tie-ins as part of its paratexts as well. But also this year, as I mentioned earlier, we've got Stephen Knight's new Great Expectations. So this is an expansion. We know that much by the fact that it's going to last for 6 hours rather than the 3 hours of the previous Great Expectations from 2011. And even that was quite lengthy compared to the standard of some Great Expectations films, for instance, which would be roughly an hour and a half. But you still wonder thematically if we really need another Great Expectations that's already had a quite kind of dark version just over 10 years ago. And the casting that has been revealed for the new Great Expectations sort of bears this out as well. So I'm going to do a bit of a casting reveal now. I'm going to suggest that Olivia Colman as Miss Havisham is not very interesting. As much as we all love Olivia Colman, I'm sure there isn't many other places to go with that role that are suggested by her casting. And same as with Fionn Whitehead as Pip. He's a young guy, he's got striking eyes, that's about as far as you can go. But there's perhaps more to be said for... Oh, this is where I crash, clearly. Goodness me. How awful. Well, I'll tell you. There we go. We've got Shalon Brune Franklin as Estella, a black Estella. So there's perhaps more interest in that piece of casting, which can connect to some discussions that scholars, including Christine in her forthcoming chapter, are talking about as well. And that screen isn't coming up, and also I've run out of time, so I think I will just cut my losses and say thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to our discussions.
Good. Thank you very much, Will, and thank you for that preview of the new Great Expectations, which I hadn't known about. And well done for struggling with the technology. Okay, so our final third paper is going to be presented by three people. So I will introduce them first and then hand over. So Diana Sandars is a scholar in the School of Culture and Communication at the University of Melbourne. She has a research focus on the child in and subject of screen media. Jessica Balanzategui is a senior lecturer in cinema and screen studies at Swinburne University of Technology. Her research includes screen genres across film, television and digital media for and about children, and horror and gothic media. And the third contributor is Djoymi Baker, a lecturer in cinema studies at RMIT University. She formerly worked in the Australian television industry. She's published work on television genres, television stardom, and children's television history. So I'm going to pass over to Diana, who's going to kick us off, I think.
Oh, thank you very much, Christine. Okay, our paper today provides a snapshot of our co-authored book that examines how Netflix repositions itself as a go-to destination for family content. And in so doing, it created a new model of family viewing tailored for the era of on-demand streaming. Combining genre studies with SVOD studies and audience research, we argue that Netflix initiated new frontiers for family television as a genre, industry model, and cultural construct. It achieved this through a flagship cycle of dark family telefantasy programs under its Family Watch Together TV catalogue label. Our paper today outlines how Netflix developed these dark family fantasies to reposition the world's most popular SVOD service as the premier destination for family content. This move refashioned what family viewing means in the streaming era. Attempting to expand its market and brand identity, Netflix moved towards families commenced in 2014, when Netflix started to commission original family content, and it cohered from about 2016 onwards, when this original strategy started to emphasise dark family fantasy shows associated with the grammatically questionable alt-genre category Family Watch Together TV. Now, Netflix identity has shifted significantly since it began as a DVD distribution service in 1997, with multiple key junctures of change, including its pivot to video streaming from 2007 into the early 2010s, and its heavy investment in originals from 2013 onwards, and then its efforts to operate as what Ramon Lobato has termed a fully global television service since 2016. We argue that from the mid-2010s to the early 2020s, Netflix Family Watch Together TV category represents another such transformational junction, operating as a key site of cultural and industrial renegotiation in Netflix's ongoing process of redefinition. As part of this broader Family Watch Together TV category, Netflix original dark family content crystallised as a genre cycle in ways that simultaneously reimagined family viewing and Netflix identity. Stranger Things operated as a prototype program that laid the groundwork for this genre cycle before the sedimentation of the Family Watch Together. We argue that Stranger Things was highly impactful on the transformational nature of this cycle. Although Stranger Things initially sat adjacent to the Family Watch Together TV category rather than within it, it has actually now shifted under the Family Watch Together TV banner. This highlights the ambiguities and tensions inherent in the labelling family television on Netflix. The other shows that we examined were all clearly marketed as filling a gap in the family viewing market, and as such have been tagged as Family Watch Together TV. These programs include A Series of Unfortunate Events, Lost in Space, Dark Crystal, Age of Resistance, and Raising Dion. Now, in reconstructing family viewing for the on-demand, non-linear streaming era, these genre cycles troubles cultural expectations shaped in large part by the legacy media forms of broadcast television and film around child-appropriate family content. And it's in these disruptions that Netflix's brand of disruptive innovation appears. Yet simultaneously, this genre cycle harnesses personal and cultural nostalgia for these pre-streaming era content types and these modes of viewing. Combining a tight historicised focus on Netflix development as an SVOD platform between 2016 and 2022, with how this development relates to the complex history of family television, our research addresses the area of definitional and transformational tension represented by Family Watch Together TV category, and in particular by the genre cycle of Netflix original dark family telefantasy series, which we position as Netflix flagship genre cycle for family audiences. This genre cycle is constructed not just via the content of the shows, but by the interface aesthetics, the tags, the labels, paratext, the recommendation algorithms, and distinctive approaches to generic categorization in the Netflix catalogue. And it's over to Djoymi now.
Netflix's pivot to Family Watch Together TV originals followed on from its successful 2014 Watch Together Family Movie Night campaign. Soon after, Netflix announced its sequel to the 90s family sitcom Full House, and media commentator Cobb proclaimed in response, "Family TV is dying. Can Netflix's bet on Fuller House save it?" In 2016, Netflix Chief Content Officer Ted Sarandos announced the streaming service was committed to, quote, doubling down on kids and families, end quote, through increased child and family-oriented originals. Despite originally attracting a strong audience, Fuller House received consistently negative reviews, and as ratings dwindled, it was eventually cancelled. By tagging Fuller House as Family Watch Together TV, Netflix was also overtly marking its shift from separate adult and children's content towards combined family content, but its reception was hardly helpful to Netflix's brand image. Fuller House was dismissed as treacly garbage that made the reboot a dirty word. So there's some quotes from the popular press. While family sitcoms function as a well-recognised family viewing staple nestled under the Family Watch Together TV tag on the Netflix interface, it has been through its original dark family telefantasy programming that the streaming service sought to articulate a narrative around a new form of family television touted as matching the quality of its adult content. This approach to family content is positioned as being aligned with Netflix's brand reputation for edgy content that, like its personalised algorithmic distribution model, is positioned as superseding broadcast and cable TV. Prior to the foregrounding of its Family Watch Together TV category, the key feature which distinguished Netflix from linear television was its personalised delivery of content independent from a schedule, as Amanda Lotz points out. Yet Netflix's dark family telefantasy content strategically repositions this feature as an agent not of atomisation and individualisation, but as a means of bringing families together to watch TV. Netflix's dark family telefantasy genre cycle thus aligns with Derek Johnson's contention that in the post-network climate of disruption, instability and change, co-viewing has become a valuable means of transforming, and I quote, engagement of consumers in the past and present into a platform for building future generations of viewers, end quote. Building on Johnson's work, we know that Netflix articulated its approach to family content along different lines than the transgenerational viewing around children's shows that he canvasses. The interface label Family Watch Together TV operates as a directive as to how to watch this content, and this, combined with the flagship content type of dark family telefantasy, provokes new ambiguities around the definition of family content in a post-network era. Brian Wright, VP of Family Content for Netflix, asserted that Netflix's goal was to make family content that was, quote, just as good, end quote, as their high-profile adult originals House of Cards and Orange is the New Black. Netflix was thereby attempting to associate its family programming with the critical acclaim and cultural prestige more commonly associated with adult quality TV. Indeed, scholarship on quality TV links the quality associated with this mode of television with distinctly adult themes, styles, and modes of address. While Netflix's family sitcoms such as Fuller House lacked the cultural capital of quality TV and received poor critical reception, Netflix found a successful family television strategy when it turned to telefantasy, a mix of science fiction, horror, and fantasy. As Catherine Johnson argues, telefantasy operates, and we quote, as a cultural category that brings together a range of different programs united by their representation of the otherworldly and unreal on the one hand, and their tendency to defy easy generic classification on the other, end quote. Andrew Lynch suggests that whereas telefantasy had once been a niche, lowbrow genre, in the 2010s programs predominantly on cable, such as The Walking Dead, Game of Thrones and Westworld, brought it into the mainstream by incorporating key elements of quality TV, such as seriality, sociocultural realism and high budgets. In turn, Netflix's cycle of dark family telefantasy under the Family Watch Together TV label on its interface necessarily severely curtails the severe violence of these programs, yet nonetheless offers younger audiences what Carl Mannheim calls fresh contact with dark and challenging genres such as horror and dark fantasy. Indeed, many of the programs in the cycle have been called the family-friendly or almost family-friendly answer to quality telefantasy programs such as Game of Thrones in the public press. And here we've got an example of the Dark Crystal as Game of Thrones with puppets. This confronted contemporary cultural and regulatory expectations around appropriate family viewing. In the attempt to attract and maintain a wide cross-section of new subscribers, Netflix Dark Family Telefantasy reimagines the family audience as edgier, more knowing, intergenerational audience than prior models of family viewing associated with television, cable and film. Netflix has used its dark family telefantasy programs as its tentpole or flagship original content to strategically promote its new family profile as a point of branding. Noel Brown notes historically in film and television, the so-called family audience symbolised respectability, profitability and mass cultural acceptance. By contrast, ambiguities around the age appropriateness and classifications of Netflix's dark family telefantasy programs have fueled controversy, questioning their suitability as Family Watch Together TV. Mike Hastings, Director of Enhanced Content at Netflix, has attempted to play down such tensions and position them in relation to Netflix's celebrated personalisation and freedom of choice, stating, and we quote, "We understand that every family is different and that parents have differing perspectives on what they feel is appropriate to watch at different ages." Hastings' comments invite a discursive approach that Jason Mitchell advocates for through a consideration of the larger cultural operations of a genre or a cycle at any given historical moment. Mitchell suggests, and I quote, "Genres do run through text, but also operate within the practices of critics, audiences and industries," end quote, that together constitute an understanding of genre, or in this case, a genre cycle more specifically. Leger Grindon explains that the genre cycle is a distinctive and more focused category than a genre, as it denotes a series of works produced during a limited period of time and linked by a dominant trend, and often produced by a single studio. Netflix greenlit, promoted and released its cycle of dark family telefantasy nestled under its preferred category of Family Watch Together TV, a category which has during this time become the substantial home of Netflix move to reality TV, an unlikely bedfellow to its dark family telefantasies. And at this point, I'll throw over to Jess.
Jess, you're muted.
Jess, you're muted.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Hopefully you can hear me now. So Family Watch Together TV represents a Netflixification, I'll try that again, of family viewing, built around distinct and specific strategies that sought to position or reposition Netflix in both the market and cultural consciousness between 2016 and 2022. So notably, this repositioning occurred at a juncture during which Netflix was focused on solidifying its newly global presence. And during this same period of global expansion, Netflix's once novel mode of personalized algorithmic distribution had become increasingly mainstream as the SVOD ecology became more crowded. And Stranger Things was Netflix's first experimentation with this new frontier in family viewing, So as we've suggested, it operates as a prototype for this genre cycle. And the show deploys a strategic combination of nostalgic intertextual references and aesthetics with dark family telefantasy, a combination that cultivates dialogue across age-based and generational lines. So we argue that this intergenerational dynamic, a feature of all the shows in the dark family telefantasy genre cycle, is key to the invitation to watch together. And we've seen this intergenerational dynamic evidenced in our audience research, which involved both a survey and also a series of semi-structured interviews with parents and their children. So I'm going to show a short clip from one of these interviews. This is with Michelle, and she's talking about watching Stranger Things with her 12-year-old son. And her comments are characteristic of this intergenerational dynamic that we define in our book. So it's a dynamic that operates at the interface between the TV text, the paratextual strategies that position the text in the interface, and the kind of off-platform marketing strategies of Netflix and audience reception, of course, as well. So here's a short clip from Michelle.
Watched Stranger Things, at least the first 2 seasons, without him. And so I said, you know, he wanted to start watching it. So I started all the way from back to scratch. So I've actually enjoyed it more watching it with him, because it made it a little bit more fun than when I watched it without him. And every time something would pop up that would remind me of my childhood, or because these kids would have been my age in the 80s, I'd say, they're drinking a drink called Tab. I drink a lot of Tab, not anymore because it's not very good for you. And he would, you know, like to tear, oh, that's called a VCR player. That's how you would play movies. So, oh, I have the exact same pair of socks as the girl. So it's actually been a lot of fun, believe it or not. Yeah. I think he enjoyed that a lot, hearing stories from my childhood. Yeah. Watch Strange.
Yet this intergenerational dynamic has also been a site of category crisis that permeates Netflix's Family Watch Together TV category, and in particular this flagship genre cycle of dark family telefantasy shows. So Stranger Things has attracted confusion on social media around its ambiguous positioning in relation to the age of its intended audience. There's a wealth of this type of online commentary in which people ask for advice as to whether children should watch the show or if it's okay for kids in certain age groups. And this categorical ambiguity at the heart of Family Watch Together TV extends to how the programs are positioned on the interface as well. So another key of our key case studies, a series of unfortunate events, carries multiple genre tags as well as the descriptors offbeat, witty and dark. And a series of unfortunate events also appears in searches for gothic movies and TV shows despite the absence of this label on the program tags itself. So the discursive practices through which both family viewing and telefantasy are articulated in the current era are thereby informed by the slippery nature of streaming interfaces. And Derek Johnson notes that while the transgenerational character of the media industry is not necessarily new, that potential takes on added significance amid digital transformations that demand negotiation of the borderlands between old and new, end quote. So we expand on Johnson's point in our book to argue that the Netflix interface also functions as a borderland in this way. It contributes to new modes of family television tailored for the SVOD era, this particular borderland. So this is the borderland that, in the absence of scheduled viewing, scaffolded by age-based kind of classification systems, solicits family viewing in a Netflix-specific way by cultivating this intergenerational dynamic through a combination of parental nostalgia and exhilarating childhood fresh contact with dark telefantasy content. So we're left with something that might figuratively resemble the pinboard in the title sequence to a series of unfortunate events, where potential clues to the mystery surrounding the orphaned Baudelaire children at the centre of the show are marked out with push pins and string. It's a very distinctive title sequence for those of you who have seen it. As it progresses, the number of pins and connecting strings become farcical in their excess, indicating to the audience not only that the mystery will be difficult to unravel, but also that there'll be multiple connections between elements of the mystery that will be difficult to understand in their entirety. So the theme song also cautions us to look away from the horror. And this is, of course, an ironic appeal as the interface simultaneously asks families to watch together. So the Family Watch Together TV label connects programs through a solicitation of shared viewing, while in turn these programs link outwards into more adult telefantasy materials that unsettle the family construct. So as we explore in the larger project, Netflix's dark family telefantasy programs under this Family Watch Together TV label intertextually connect across family television and family film, but also adult quality telefantasy programs. So ultimately, while Netflix's pivot towards family content initially hinged on the family sitcom, these lacked cultural prestige and were poorly received. But by contrast, Netflix was able to assert its identity as a prestige family service around its dark family telefantasy offerings. So in this way, the Family Watch Together TV label and Netflix's interface provokes this kind of transformational tension around what family television and family viewing might mean in the streaming era. So thank you, everyone. We will leave it there.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. That's 3 terrific presentations, and thank you so much to everyone for keeping to time, which makes my life much easier. So we're going to move to questions, and I'd like to ask people in the audience to volunteer questions or comments. We've been very much dealing with contemporary television, which, as Christina reminded us, is a complicated thing to do, but nevertheless, I think very worthwhile here. You can put your questions, you can either indicate you want to ask a question by putting up your hand, or you can put questions into the chat, and Elka is dealing with the chat. So we've had we've got a very wide range of areas here around television. There's been some discussion of values and quality and how that's presented in television. What kind of values, what kind of qualities are offered to audiences. We've had some discussions of aesthetics in the widest sense. We've had discussion of delivery, the adaptation and changes involved when you move, when you move delivery, change status of delivery, as Netflix has. And we've had a little glimpse of audience reaction, which is always interesting. I thought I would just ask, while people think of questions to ask, I wondered if I could ask Christina and Will to perhaps comment on the impact of darkness, which was obviously a feature of the third paper, but it strikes me that darkness may be a phenomenon in some of the work that you've been discussing. So Christina, darkness, how important is that to, sorry, Article 80 was it, that you've been discussing? Or isn't it?
I think, as in darkness, as in the content being dark, you mean? Is that the idea?
Yes, or as an aesthetic, a way of complexifying what the content is.
Oh, that's a really difficult question, actually.
Okay.
I'm thinking, because the other adaptations I've looked at, and I'd previously written a chapter that kind of intersects with Will's ideas really about this expansion of the story world, and that was focused on Hannibal and Bates Motel, which again are very dark texts, and I think there's definitely a tendency to want to expand or try and understand those dark narratives because it's related to, you know, a fear, and trying to expansion we kind of equate with understanding, right? So I think there is something there in trying to expand or revisit. There's a sense that we may be able to kind of gain control over that narrative somehow. Yeah.
I was just thinking, because television is or in the past, of course, has been associated with being in the home and not presenting anything that is, you know, too difficult for home viewing. And obviously the third paper is talking about that shift, but I wondered if it was there's a more general shift in genre and aesthetics here. Will, what about A Christmas Carol and the darkness of the night presentation?
Yes, dark in a lot of ways. I think, and that's kind of it's partly a thing in terms of kind of marketing, particularly with adaptations, kind of classic serial adaptations, and Dickens in particular, the idea that this is the serious one. This is the one where you're going to actually see more about the world and not just have a kind of comic larks kind of thing. In fact, I think Sarah Phelps, who did Great Expectations in 2011, talked specifically about it through removing Uncle Joe saying what larks as like the overall idea of her approach to the adaptation, which leads me to my final thought of kind of what's new in this new Great Expectations, when we've already had the dark one and now we're having another dark one that's just double the length of it. So I'm sure Stephen and I's got some ideas, but it strikes me that it's perhaps a lost opportunity to not do some less well-known Dickens adaptations.
Yeah.
Like Dombey and Son is in my mind, particularly as one that's basically, I think, was done once a long time ago and no one really knows the story. And you think you could go further in terms of building on our cultural sense of Dickens through a narrative that people don't know so well and hasn't been adapted so frequently and so recently. But in terms of
sorry, I'm going to cut you off there because I've got Elka has got a question for us. So I think we will take that. Thank you, Will. Elka.
It is actually me asking the question. So
Good.
One of the things that really struck me when I was listening to your papers and watching and looking at the pictures in particular, I kept thinking, oh my God, this is like my life, basically. I remember very fondly how much there was a thing about the Dark Crystal in my childhood. I remember very strongly the 1990s and how we were so edgy and cool with our voice recording and whatever. But also, I then became a bit more sophisticated and watched a lot of Dickens. And so I was wondering, for all of you, how much this is actually also about nostalgia and speaking to the nostalgia of a particular age group in order to get them to engage with the content that we get to see. So that's my question.
Okay, so who would like to start there? Let's go to the presenters of the third paper. Diana, do you want to comment, or Jess?
That's a great question, Elka, and it's definitely something that we've looked at quite extensively. And it's in that concept of, and I think you nailed it too, that in the way you expressed the question, which was that to get them to watch. And I'm here a parent in that question. So it's that, how do we get the next generation down to care about what we care about, I think is the kind of question. And we've been looking at the rituals around family viewing, which is something that Netflix is alluding back to. And it's also, I think it refers, what's happening in our programs is a little bit like Christina touched on, with that process of adaptation as expansion. So becoming like more relevant to the contemporary era. But it's interesting for us how our objects from our childhood or youth have become fetishized objects through these TV shows. So like tape recorders and DVD players, VCR players, DVDs as well. Jess and Djoymi would definitely have far more interesting things to say about this as well.
I would just briefly add that, again, like it's very interesting to hear the get them to watch phrase, Elke, because that 100% gets to one of our key arguments, which is that it's a strategic deployment of nostalgia that supports this intergenerational dynamic that we were referring to. It kind of, that nostalgia, like Stranger Things is such an obvious case study because it, is very fixated on the aesthetics of kind of everyday life in the 80s and the media technologies and all of those kind of nostalgic textures. So very much inviting, older millennials, Gen X, to kind of just get immersed in that in a way that also, as Michelle captures in her audience, in her response to our interview, kind of invite the child to share in that nostalgia, or to have access to her own childhood past, or our audience's own childhood pasts via the show. So in the dark telefantasy family shows that we're looking at in our book, it's a pretty pervasive feature, manifesting in different ways, but like this kind of nostalgia that encourages these kind of intergenerational family connections.
Okay, anyone else on that?
Yes,
Christina.
It's not so much nostalgia. I was trying to think about this, but really in the series, as I kind of briefly touched upon in the paper, there's this kind of alienating effect of particularly old technology, and that it is restrictive in many ways, and it's not seen as nostalgic perhaps, but kind of limiting. Even I was trying to think, and it sounds like such a trite reference, but it also almost reminds me of, you know, those BuzzFeed articles where it's like, oh, Gen Z won't understand what these technologies can do, and they're not seen as, oh, let's go back to the past, it's a great place, but they're literally trapped there, they're stuck there, it's seen as a bad thing, and it's horrific. So there's not a let's go back and relive like Stranger Things, the vibe of that, and the auras are particularly, you know, much warmer, much more nostalgic, even though, you know, the things that are going on. But in Archive 81, they're stuck there, these bad things are happening, the technology has limited them. So I think there's a very different approach, and maybe that's to do with the childhood aspect of Stranger Things and the kind of more adult, older generation of, look what, you know, the technology has left or done to us, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, can I just quickly jump in? So I was interested to ask Christina, and that seems like a very good place to just quickly ask. Like, so this show is obviously a very kind of adult-oriented horror show, the Archive 81. Yeah. So it's quite underpinned by horror themes, I'd say. It has been cancelled, annoyingly. They seem to be heading towards season 2, and then a few weeks later they decided that they were going to not go ahead with season 2, which I kind of found really frustrating because it did really well, and I think it, you know, presented some kind of interesting challenges into how we think about medium and adaptations of things like podcasts. So although becoming more regular, are still rare, and I think it's more interesting than going back over the content we've seen before. But, you know, as evidenced by the most recent Persuasion adaptation that I've not heard great things about, we like to keep adapting the same things over and over again.
Yes. Okay. Will, I was just sort of thinking in relation to yours that scheduling for a British viewer is still quite important in relation to how those particular adaptations are aimed at audiences. So the darker one, The Christmas Carol, goes out at 9 o'clock, I think it was. Dickensian was at 8 o'clock, and Dodger is on CBBC. So do you think dealing with the BBC is a bit different from dealing with Netflix, in fact?
In a sense, yes, and I should have actually mentioned that A Christmas Carol was a co-production with FX, so it's probably largely consumed online, as well as stripped over the 3 nights after Christmas in the UK, as often happens. And often with Dickens, it's still being attached to the Christmas schedules, annoyingly. So Dickensian started at Christmas over multiple nights and then settled into 2 nights a week. And Christmas Carol was over 3 days. I would put money on Great Expectations starting this Christmas and then running through January. That seems pretty likely. So it seems it's still really nostalgia. Actually, it's a really great point in terms of nostalgia, Christine, in terms of nostalgia for that kind of scheduling slots as well on Sunday night. And sometimes you think, if you're doing something innovative and doing something different, put it on in a different way so people can see that. And that seems to escape the notice of trying to have the best of both worlds with the scheduling sometimes, I think. So yes, thank you for that, Christine. It's a really great point.
Okay, good. Okay, I'm also yes, one person raised their hands now. I see that. Oh yes, Djoymi.
Will, just following on from that last, point about, well, we can expect Great Expectations to run over Christmas because that's where they normally do it. And I wondered if you speak to that tension between, isn't that a tension that's always there in adaptation to an extent between adapting something that's come before, so that idea of fidelity and nostalgia and familiarity, with the fact that if you make it too much like what became before, it's very ho-hum, you know, like you need some point of difference. But the tricky part is finding the sweet spot between those two things, between the fidelity and the innovation.
Yeah. But,
sorry,
but as we begin to adapt different things, I mean, with the podcast, for instance, well, I suppose podcasts have big audiences and therefore some notion of a source can be possible. Is that right? Will, Christina, whatever?
I'd definitely say so, because the podcast did hugely well and they're doing that with other things. But there's even things that have been adapted, like a series of tweets that got made into a film. For example, last year, it was a Twitter dispute that got turned into a film. So we are moving towards those kinds of adaptations, but the ones that seem to continuously proliferate are the ones that we have done before, I would say. I think it's this idea of knowing and understanding, and even if it does seem, you know, it does distance itself from the original source text, it's still informed by the kind of the web of intertext that all the other adaptations can join with it, which I guess, Will, you've seen when you're looking at your Dickens adaptations.
Yeah, I think there's two things at play here. So in terms of Dickens adaptations, why I think it's really interesting to connect it with the movements in adaptation at the moment is that it's a very traditional space. So some of those traditional notions of fidelity still gets thrown up, but also it has got caught up in a big kind of intertextual web over the years, because really the cultural knowledge of a lot of Dickens text, if not all of Dickens text, has come from its adaptations, and the cultural awareness that's built up across them and through them over the decades. So it's almost like the with each subsequent adaptation the initial text gets obscured, and then you get people saying, oh, we're going back to the text or back to the Dickens or whatever, and all these discourses fly up around it. So the notion of fidelity there becomes complex and a bit muddy, because you think, really, you know, fidelity to what? Which is why I like that notion of fidelity to the spirit from Maclean, talking about Watchmen, because that's really the notion of, rather than being direct to the letter of something that most of the viewership don't even know the letter of it. You know, you're true to the spirit and also bringing something new to the table, and seeing Dickens as a whole as that kind of cultural sense, kind of in my mind opens the door to more innovative things like Dickensian, and also the texts that are adapted less often, like we saw with Bleak House and Little Dorrit before, and sadly mostly veering back towards a lot of Great Expectations and A Christmas Carol since then.
Okay, I must say, true to the spirit is one of those phrases that my hackles are instantly raised, but I don't think we'll go down that road at the moment. Because the other thing I would like to discuss with you, I think, although Elka's got a hand raised. Elka?
Yeah, I was just wondering,
Did you have
I don't have a question, but basically there's a bit of chat going on, which is largely basically saying, oh, I think I'm going to check this out and I'm going to check that out and stuff. But Djoymi just said something which I think might be worthwhile discussing a bit further, which is bringing something new. The prequel tendency seems limiting, as you point out, Will. So I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, Djoymi.
Yeah, I mean, we see a tendency towards prequel, and it even gets called prequelitis when someone called it in the press, in literary adaptations, but in other adaptations as well. We see it in our dark family fantasy cycle with the Dark Crystal. We see it in the Star Trek franchise. We see it in quite a lot of things. But, or in Star Wars on Disney, and a lot of the commentary around it is the problem is that it's hard to build dramatic tension when you know exactly where all these characters are going to end up. So Christina and Will, I don't know if you had any thoughts about this, about the limitations of adaptation when we think about that tendency for prequels.
Yeah, well, I can expand a bit on my experience, I suppose, watching Dickensian, which is that I became increasingly very frustrated by the fact that all its narratives were prequel narratives, because it offers such potential to do something much more revisionary and interesting. And it starts to with Oliver Twist in its last few episodes. Oliver himself shows up in the last few, and the start, his "please sir, can I have some more" moment, plays out in a different context towards the end. So you think, oh, at last you're doing something revisionary, but it feels too little too late, because you still have Miss Havisham's story seemingly concluding with her being jilted, and there doesn't seem anywhere else to go with that. The Honoria Barbary story that leads towards the birth of the heroine of Bleak House, Esther, plays out, doesn't seem to be anywhere else to go with that. So it seems like it created a lot of terminal points that it didn't need to, and then had to try and course correct towards the end when they decided they actually might like to make some more, and that didn't seem quite enough. So it didn't take advantage narratively of the potential of its really fascinating concept, in my view.
I think
Christina, anything on prequels?
So when I've written about this before, and my exploration of it is that I think it's very strongly linked to fan culture. And I think because the texts, the ones that usually have prequels, are those which are very well regarded in culture, have become very strong cultural figures. Trying to touch or expand upon after, or the story as we know it, would cause such a big backlash. But trying to understand or add an understanding or a depth to the character that we already love or have an interest in, like Hannibal Lecter or Sherlock Holmes or etc. There's always an appetite for that. And as you say, because we know that things can't be changed, there's a certain safety net there in that it's okay to go back because nothing will change, and the stuff that we still cling on to as a culture and we like and we admire won't change at all. So I think it's a kind of link to fan from my perspective.
Yeah. Yes, I was thinking that one of the things that has come up in this session, as indeed in many others, is around the kind of what is television now theme, and it strikes me prequels I always associate with cinema, but that's because I am so old-fashioned, and that's where the impetus first came from, and it doesn't seem to me to suit television narratives particularly well. But I'd like to, I wondered more generally about a shift in what the television as a medium does, and that notion of it's now being more complex, more layered, that notion of it, the quote that you had about television throwing things at us much more and, demanding, in a sense, much more of us, and that maybe Dickensian underestimated that element of it a bit. I don't know, but so we're moving to a different kind of television. It strikes me that the quote you used from Jarrah Miller is about television now, not about television in the past. Is whether there's been a big change in what the medium of television is. I don't know whether that provokes any thoughts. Diana, you nodded vaguely then.
Yeah, but this is something that's come across our research very much, and I agree with you, Christine. Like that, one of the interesting things that a series of unfortunate events does is it actually refers back to the early Hollywood serial very, very clearly. So it's establishing this whole new Netflix cycle, or its mark of quality and prestige, by referring itself back to a serial format from the very, very beginning, and so that it is actually cinematic in that serialized format, and so it comes back to that. It's throwing everything at you, and in some ways I keep conceiving of what's happening with Netflix now as actually very much a high concept moment where we're getting a lot of familiar stuff thrown at us in a very palatable, easily consumable way. So beautiful aesthetics and fantastic use of music score. So stuff we did see in the 1980s, high concept TV, high concept cinema, is now coming back down to us through this Netflix cycle. So when we're talking about this interesting thing of like that period in the 90s of all the sequels, for us, we liken what the programs we're looking at, especially Stranger Things, to the Harry Potter series, where the sequel was going across cinema like as an annual event that you would go and see the new Harry Potter movie, and you grew up with Harry Potter, and it's this thing. So it's a different way to conceive serialization and how serial narratives, cinematic serial narratives, actually now work in like non-linear TV kind of format, which kind of comes back to that notion of everything's being thrown at us. So we are, you know, we know serial television, like we've broadcast TV, we've been raised on serial television and the cliffhangers and stuff. That's not what's going on now. We're actually seeing far more conventions, serial conventions that belong to Hollywood than that would be like, we just see that because we get the references, like for ours, it's the references to Harry Potter, it's the references to Jurassic Park, it's the reference to all the Spielberg kind of stuff that we've got going throughout of our programs. And I do find it interesting in terms of Dickensian stuff that it's the familiar stuff that's coming back. So the family narratives that are familiar, and you know, like once the Muppets have done like A Christmas Carol and stuff, you know that it's like it's got a multi-generational audience and familiarity. So the Dickensian stuff manages to hang on to its prestige because it's Dickens. But it also manages to speak to quite a diverse audience in that way, and it's that comfort of the familiar. So
I think sadly it didn't manage it because it never got a second series, which Tony Jordan was very sad about. I'm going to bring this to a close, but I know I've discovered, Elka, I can see the chat and I can see there's a question for Christina in that. So could you read that question and then we'll finish with that?
There's actually also a question from Michael, which I think has been there for longer. Michael, do you want to ask that question yourself?
That's what I was thinking, yeah.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you see me?
Not yet.
Ooh.
Just speak then.
There we go. Hello. Hi, everyone.
There you are.
Yeah, thank you all for your fascinating papers. It's been a really great way to start the Monday morning. But I have a question for Christina specifically, which is about the relationship between television and audio mediums. So I guess I'll just read out the question as is. But if we think of mediums, I guess as Ted Nanacelli kind of proposes, I'm very much an acolyte of his, as like a cluster of relatively stable practices for making things. Also notions of continuity and what is being adapted to TV. I'm interested in the notion that Archive 81 is an adaptation of a podcast, and how that kind of, in a way, brings us back to the notion of TV as canned radio almost, as, you know, I mean, I guess back in the 50s that would maybe be a limitation or considered a limitation. You know, TV could never overcome that kind of limitation of just being, you know, radio with pictures and poor quality images. So yeah, I'm curious about how Archive 81 fits into that kind of trajectory. And I think Djoymi sort of added to that and saying, like, I guess we could think of it as maybe a hybrid. And then, you know, how I guess, you know, as a recent iteration of this kind of adaptation of an audio medium, how it, I guess, these questions of esteem as well, and how other mediums are all sort of colliding into one. It's very
I think there's the difference, I think, is being that, well, the key difference is that radio is very different to podcast in that anyone can set up a podcast, right? But the institutions of it are different, and I think I'm not an expert enough in terms of the connections between the audio and television. Usually I focus on film to TV adaptations. I'm always interested in why people go to TV as an adaptation rather than book to film, which is the most boring of hierarchies for me. But I think TV offers something, I think it offers more opportunities for a merging of different forms of medium specific practices than other mediums do. And I think that's why something like Archive 81 that comes from an oral source can use elements of the cinematic, elements of the televisual, elements of the oral. I think it's just the ways in which TV functions and is continuing to change and develop with streaming and the kind of intertextual links it has as well, I think allows it to be this centre of a web, as it were, of different texts, much more than other mediums perhaps would.
Right. Well, I think that is a very good note on which to close. That's a very interesting comment. So thank you very much to our presenters, but it has been a terrifically interesting panel and pulled together some quite disparate things, which is always interesting. Elke, I don't know if you want to remind us of when the next session is. I forgot to check.
Yes, the next session is at 2 o'clock British time. So it's a panel that really examines what we mean with television, because we're basically being invited to consider CCTV as television.
Okay, good. Well, thank you very much to you all, and a good night to the people who are elsewhere. Okay, thanks very much. Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks so much, Christine.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you, everybody.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Christine. Thanks, Elke.
Lovely to see you
Pleasure.
all. Thank you. Bye.
Hi, Elke. Can you hear me? I can't hear you. I think you're on mute. I'm having problems with Teams and I don't know why. Me too. Oh, hold on. I'm trying to record this now. Not record this now. I want to stop it recording. This is weird. Okay. Right. Now.
So in Dickensian, Mrs. Cratchit is the murderer of Jacob Marley. Yet, despite this obviously giving her a very prominent role in the narrative, she still acts spontaneously and is still unable to control her destiny both during the attack and after. She is eventually saved from being hanged, but only at the decision of Inspector Bucket, who we saw her confessing to there. So Dickensian is also notably a world where a female murder is unthinkable. So despite the fact that Inspector Bucket in Bleak House uncovers a woman as the murderer of the crime in that novel, in Dickensian he has no notion that a woman could be the murderer at all. In fact, Emily has to directly confess in front of him before he can even contemplate the notion. And she's also not part of the implied all-male suspect group that is foregrounded at the time of the murder in the first episode. So this exposes Mrs. Cratchit's historic marginalisation through both Dickens' novella and subsequent adaptations alike. In Stephen Knight's A Christmas Carol, however, Mrs. Cratchit's agency is fulfilled. She combines the justified rage of Miss Havisham in Dickensian with the exposure of her voice's absence in A Christmas Carol, the novella. So here in A Christmas Carol, she's named Mary and played by Vinette Robinson on the right, and combines Emily's desperation with Amelia's justified rage. Sorry, that was a bit repetitive. I should have checked my notes one more time. But she also finds her own transcendent power as a result. The extension of the A Christmas Carol narrative around Mary is similar to the act of culturally focused adaptation exemplified by Watchmen also. So I'm going to show another clip of Mary Cratchit from A Christmas Carol. I need to give you a bit of background for this one because the drama was very slow paced, so I couldn't show you too much of it. So in this scene, Tiny Tim has needed a costly operation and Mary has agreed to do Scrooge's bidding in return for the money. But after she undresses at his house, he dismisses her with the payment, wishing only to establish how far she was willing to go. He describes this rather coarsely as an intellectual form of intercourse. So as he continues to admonish her and implies that her husband is of more value than her justified female rage is let loose, as we'll see here.